The wind howled through the dense pine forest, its mournful cry weaving through the trees like a warning. Erin tightened her scarf around her neck, her breath visible in the biting cold. She had taken the isolated route home from her weekend hiking trip, a shortcut through the wilderness, supposedly safe but undeniably eerie as twilight set in. She thought little of the stories she had heard from the locals about the forest being cursed. Superstitions weren't her thing. The first sign that something was wrong came when she noticed the absolute silence. The forest, alive with the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves just moments earlier, had gone deathly quiet. No crickets, no wind through the branches, nothing but her crunching footsteps on the frost-covered ground. Her stomach churned with unease, but she pressed on, reminding herself of the logic behind nature's stillness. Perhaps a predator was nearby. She gripped her flashlight tighter and picked up her pace. Then came the laughter. High-pitched, almost childlike, it echoed faintly through the trees, seemingly distant yet unnervingly close. Erin froze, her breath catching in her throat. It couldn't be a child. No one else was supposed to be out here, especially not in the middle of nowhere this late. She scanned her surroundings with the flashlight, its narrow beam slicing through the oppressive darkness. Nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the thick fog rolling in. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The sound of her own voice unnerved her. It felt swallowed by the darkness, the echo muted as if the forest had absorbed it. She waited, straining to hear an answer, but only the faint laughter came again, closer this time. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to run and not look back. Erin spun on her heel, deciding to double back and return to the main trail. But when she turned, the path was gone. No footprints in the snow, no familiar markers. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself, the trees closing ranks in an impenetrable wall. Panic flared, and she clutched her flashlight like a lifeline. The laughter transformed, growing deeper, guttural, and mocking. "Not lost," a voice whispered behind her, low and guttural. She whipped around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. The fog had thickened, swirling around her ankles like a living thing, creeping higher with each passing second. Erin stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering ominously, the battery suddenly failing despite being fully charged earlier. In the fading light of the flashlight, something moved in the distance, just at the edge of her vision. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs grotesquely elongated, swayed like a tree in the breeze. Its head cocked unnaturally to one side, as though studying her. She gasped, her legs rooted to the ground, unable to tear her gaze away as it began to move toward her in a slow, deliberate glide, never breaking eye contact. "Help!" she screamed, finally finding her voice. She turned and ran, branches slapping her face and tearing at her jacket as she plunged through the underbrush. Her lungs burned, her heart raced, but no matter how far she ran, the laughter followed, echoing in every direction. Her foot caught on a root, and she fell hard, the wind knocked out of her. She lay there, gasping, as the fog thickened, now wrapping around her arms and legs like icy fingers. And then she saw it. The figure loomed over her, its face a void of shifting shadows, the faint outlines of teeth grinning from the darkness. Its arm extended, unnaturally long fingers reaching for her face. The last thing Erin remembered was the sound of her own scream, cut short as the darkness swallowed her whole. Days later, hikers found Erin's abandoned backpack on the trail. Her friends reported her missing, but the search yielded nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, not even a scent for the dogs to follow. Locals shook their heads knowingly and muttered about the forest's curse. Months later, campers deep in the forest reported hearing laughter at night, high-pitched and childlike, echoing through the trees. Some claimed to see a figure watching them from the shadows, impossibly tall and swaying like a tree in the wind. No one stayed long enough to see it up close. The forest doesn't let its secrets go. It started with the doorbell at 3:03 a.m. Nicole jolted awake, heart pounding as the shrill sound cut through the stillness of her suburban home. She glanced at her phone to check the time. Nobody rings the doorbell at that hour, at least not with good intentions. She hesitated before sliding out of bed, wrapping herself in a robe. The doorbell rang again, longer, more insistent. Peeking through the curtains of her second-story bedroom, she saw nothing but the empty street bathed in dim orange light from the street lamp. No cars, no movement. Her breath fogged the window as she stared out, searching. The doorbell rang a third time. "Who's there?" she called from the top of the stairs, her voice trembling. No answer. Her hands shook as she made her way down, gripping the banister for support. The shadows seemed deeper tonight, the house unusually quiet. She reached the front door and stood still, listening. Through the peephole, she saw only the empty porch, no sign of anyone. And then 3 sharp knocks. Nicole's stomach turned. She unlocked her phone and dialed 911, but before she could press call, her phone buzzed with a notification. Front door camera motion detected. Her heart stopped. She'd installed the camera a week ago and hadn't had to use it yet. She opened the app with trembling fingers, the live feed taking a second too long to load. The image came up. There was a man standing directly in front of the door, his face too close to the camera. He had no eyes, only sunken black voids where they should have been. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth stretched unnaturally wide in a grin that seemed to split his face in half. He didn't move, didn't blink. Nicole stumbled back, dropping her phone. The sound of the knock came again, louder, more forceful. She clutched her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When she dared to look at her phone again, the screen showed static. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence was worse. Gathering what little courage she had, Nicole crept to the peephole again, half expecting the man to be there, grinning at her through the tiny lens. But there was nothing, only the empty porch and the street beyond. She stepped back, exhaling shakily. Maybe it was a nightmare. Maybe she'd imagined the whole thing. She picked up her phone to call the police anyway, but the moment she unlocked it, a new notification popped up. Motion detected, back door. Nicole froze. The back door led to her kitchen. It was locked. She was sure of it. But the thought of someone back there sent a shiver down her spine. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from the kitchen. She clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Her mind raced as she scanned the room for anything she could use to defend herself. A lamp? A fireplace poker? She grabbed the first thing she could find, a heavy vase, and edged toward the kitchen. The footsteps stopped. Nicole peeked around the corner. The back door stood wide open, swaying slightly in the wind. Her legs felt like jelly as she stared into the dark void beyond. And then she heard it. A whisper. Low, guttural, and inhuman. It came from directly behind her. She spun around, raising the vase, but there was no one there. Just shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls, twisting and writhing like they were alive. "Leave," the whisper said, so close it felt like it was inside her head. Nicole dropped the vase, the sound of it shattering breaking the oppressive silence. She bolted out the back door, barefoot and terrified, running as fast as she could down the dark street. She didn't stop until she reached a neighbor's house and banged on the door, sobbing. When the police arrived, they found no signs of forced entry. The security camera footage was corrupted, showing only static. Nicole never returned to the house. Weeks later, the new owners of the property reported hearing knocks at 3 a.m. They ignored it at first. But when they checked their camera feed one night, they saw him, a man with no eyes, standing in the same spot, grinning at the door, and then the knocking started again. The sun was long gone, leaving only the pale glow of a crescent moon to light the narrow country road. Samantha drove in silence, her headlights slicing through the mist that had settled over the fields. She hadn't meant to stay at her friend's house so late, but the time had slipped away. Now she was paying for it with a growing sense of unease. The road home was isolated, winding through woods and farmland. There were no streetlights, no other cars, only the dense fog swallowing the road. Samantha turned up the radio, trying to drown out her nerves, but every station was static. And then she saw it. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, walking along the side of the road. As she drew closer, Samantha realized it was a woman, barefoot and wearing what looked like a long white gown. Her hair hung in matted tangles, and she didn't look up as Samantha's car approached. Samantha slowed down, her heart racing. Something about the woman didn't sit right. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, as she shuffled forward. Against her better judgment, Samantha rolled down the window slightly. "Are you okay?" she called out. The woman stopped. For a moment, Samantha thought she hadn't heard her, but then the woman's head turned sharply, too sharply, to face her. The woman's eyes were wrong, wide, unblinking, and reflecting the light like an animal's. Her lips curled into a grin that stretched unnaturally across her face. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice raspy and hollow as if coming from far away. Samantha's instincts screamed at her to drive, but she hesitated, her grip tightening on the wheel. The woman took a step closer, her bare feet making no sound on the asphalt. "Please, help me," she said again, louder this time, her voice distorted, as though layered with something deeper, darker. That was enough. Samantha slammed her foot on the gas, the tires screeching as she sped away. In her rearview mirror, she saw the woman standing in the middle of the road, still grinning, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. But then, the figure started to move, running after the car. Samantha's breath caught as she watched the woman, impossibly fast, gaining on her. The headlights illuminated her face for a split second, revealing that the grin had widened grotesquely, splitting her cheeks. The woman's arms flailed wildly, her fingers clawing at the air. The car lurched as Samantha pushed it to its limits, the speedometer climbing higher. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the mirror. The woman was still there, her movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman was gone. Samantha didn't slow down, her heart pounding as she sped through the fog. She didn't stop until she reached her driveway, her house a beacon of safety in the darkness. But as she turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, she froze. In the silence of the night, she heard it, a faint, raspy whisper. "Help me." Samantha whipped around, her eyes scanning the empty yard. Nothing moved. The whisper came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of bare feet on gravel. Terrified, Samantha ran inside, locking every door and window. She sat in the living room with every light on, clutching her phone. She never saw the woman again, but for weeks afterward, she would wake in the middle of the night to faint whispers outside her window. The old motel sat on the edge of a forgotten highway, its flickering neon sign reading "Vacancy" in sputtering red light. Jared pulled into the gravel lot, his car sputtering to a halt. A thick fog had rolled in, and he'd been driving for hours without passing another soul. He had no choice but to stop for the night. The lobby smelled of mildew, and the clerk, a gaunt man with hollow eyes and a yellowed smile, barely looked up as Jared asked for a room. The key he slid across the counter was cold to the touch, the brass tag engraved with a simple Room 6. The room was as bleak as the lobby, faded floral wallpaper peeling at the edges, a buzzing overhead light, and a bed that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in decades. Jared sighed, too tired to care, and tossed his bag onto the sagging mattress. He double-checked the locks on the door and window before collapsing onto the bed. It started with the tapping. At first, Jared thought it was the old pipes or the wind against the window. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder, more deliberate, like fingernails drumming against glass. Sitting up, he scanned the room. The only window faced the empty parking lot, now shrouded in fog so thick it looked like a solid wall. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking. The tapping stopped. He crept to the window and peered out, but there was nothing but his own reflection staring back. Jared laughed nervously, convincing himself it was just his imagination. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps, this time on the door. Jared froze. No one else was staying at the motel. He'd seen the empty lot when he pulled in. His breath hitched as he tiptoed to the peephole. The hallway beyond was empty. A chill ran down his spine. Jared turned back toward the bed, his heart pounding. He was halfway across the room when the knock came again, louder, more insistent. Summoning his courage, he flung the door open, ready to confront whoever or whatever was messing with him. The hallway was empty, but something was wrong. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the flickering light above the door cast long, unnatural shadows that seemed to stretch and twist on their own. Jared slammed the door shut, his hands trembling as he locked it. And then he saw it. The mirror on the far wall. At first he thought it was just his reflection, but the figure in the glass didn't match his movements. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes black and endless. Jared stumbled back, his pulse racing as the figure in the mirror began to move, its mouth stretching into a jagged, toothy grin. Slowly, it raised one hand and pointed directly at him. "No," Jared whispered, backing into the corner. The light overhead buzzed louder, then shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Jared fumbled for his phone, its weak flashlight barely illuminating the room. When he turned it toward the mirror, the figure was gone. But the door was now wide open, leading into a pitch-black hallway that hadn't been there before. The fog outside began to pour into the room, curling around his legs like living tendrils. And then from the darkness, a voice. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The fog surged forward, engulfing Jared in an icy embrace. His screams echoed briefly before being swallowed by silence. The next morning, the clerk sat behind the desk, his yellowed smile unchanging as a new traveler walked in. Room 6's key lay on the counter, waiting. It was supposed to be a routine camping trip, just a weekend getaway with friends to unwind in the remote wilderness. The kind of place where cell service was non-existent, and the night sky stretched endlessly overhead. There were 4 of them. Ryan, Claire, Mia, and Alex. They'd picked a clearing deep in the forest, far from any trails or other campers, the perfect spot to disconnect from the world. The first night passed without incident, just the usual laughter around the campfire, ghost stories, and the occasional rustling in the bushes that they dismissed as animals. But the second night was different. It started with the sound. They were sitting around the fire again, roasting marshmallows, when Ryan tilted his head. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. The others stopped talking, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Then they heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping like someone knocking on wood. "Woodpecker?" Mia suggested, but her tone was uncertain. The tapping grew louder, closer, and it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from the ground. "Okay, that's creepy," Claire said, clutching her jacket tighter. Alex stood, grabbing a flashlight. "It's probably just a branch or something. I'll check it out." "Don't go too far," Ryan warned, but Alex waved him off and disappeared into the trees. The 3 remaining friends waited, the tapping continuing its steady rhythm. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Alex didn't come back. "Alex?" Mia called, her voice trembling. No answer. Ryan grabbed another flashlight and stood. "I'll find him. Stay here." "Like hell you're going alone," Claire said, standing beside him. The 2 of them ventured into the woods, leaving Mia by the fire, her eyes darting nervously around the clearing. The tapping stopped. Mia sat frozen, her hands gripping the edges of her chair. The silence was suffocating, the kind of silence that made her ears ring. And then, from somewhere behind her, came a low, guttural whisper. "Mia." She spun around, the blood draining from her face. The firelight flickered weakly, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Mia." The voice came again, raspy and distorted. She stumbled backward, her flashlight trembling in her hands as she shone it into the trees. Nothing, just darkness. And then she saw it. A figure stood just beyond the firelight, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Its face, if it even had one, was a pale, featureless void. "Mia," the voice came again, but the figure's mouth didn't move. She screamed, running blindly into the woods, her flashlight bouncing wildly. She didn't stop until she collided with Ryan and Claire, both pale and wide-eyed. "Where's Alex?" Ryan asked, but Mia could only shake her head, gasping for air. The 3 of them huddled together, the flashlight beams trembling as they scanned the trees. The tapping started again, louder this time, echoing from all directions. Then they heard Alex's voice. "Guys, where are you?" It was faint, distant, but unmistakably him. They called out, running toward the sound, relief flooding their chests. But as they ran, the voice didn't get closer. It stayed the same distance away, always just out of reach. "Something's wrong," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. The tapping grew deafening, drowning out Alex's voice. Suddenly, the ground beneath them seemed to shift, like something massive was moving just beneath the surface. The trees around them swayed violently, though there was no wind. A low, inhuman growl rumbled from the darkness, and they saw it again, the same twisted figure, now closer, its featureless face turned toward them. "Run," Ryan whispered. They didn't need to be told twice. The 3 of them sprinted through the forest, branches clawing at their clothes and faces. The tapping and growling followed, relentless, as if the forest itself was alive and chasing them. By the time they reached their campsite, it was destroyed. The tents were shredded, the fire extinguished, and Alex's flashlight lay on the ground, its beam flickering weakly. There was no sign of Alex. They didn't stop running until they reached the road, collapsing onto the asphalt, gasping for breath. When they returned with the authorities the next day, the campsite was gone. Not destroyed, just gone. No tents, no fire pit, no gear. It was as if they had never been there, and Alex was never found. Weeks later, Ryan, Claire and Mia began hearing tapping at night, faint but insistent. It never stopped. The town of Black Hollow was quiet, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a place where everyone knew everyone and secrets rarely stayed buried. But there was one place even the locals avoided: Ashburn Manor. The house sat on the outskirts of town, a hulking Victorian structure that loomed over the landscape like a predator. It had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and its walls covered in ivy. People whispered that something was wrong with it, something evil. Hannah didn't believe in ghost stories. She was a freelance photographer, passing through Black Hollow on assignment to capture America's forgotten places. When the locals warned her about the manor, it only piqued her curiosity. "You don't go up there," the diner waitress had said, her voice low. "People who do don't come back the same, if they come back at all." Hannah had smiled politely and ignored the warning. She drove to the manor just before dusk, eager to get the perfect shot of its crumbling grandeur. The gate creaked loudly as she pushed it open, and the air seemed colder inside the grounds. The overgrown garden was eerily quiet, not even the sound of birds or insects. The front door hung ajar, as if inviting her in. Her camera clicked as she moved through the house, capturing its decayed beauty. The grand staircase was rotting, the chandelier above it swaying gently, though there was no breeze. She felt a strange heaviness in the air, like the house was watching her. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, she found an old rocking chair, its wood cracked and splintered. It sat in front of a window that overlooked the garden. As she snapped a photo, the chair began to rock. Hannah froze, the hairs on her arms standing up. The air grew colder, her breath now visible in the dim light. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The chair stopped. Then, from the hallway, she heard the faint sound of footsteps. She whipped around, her heart racing. "Is someone there?" No answer. Clutching her camera, she stepped into the hallway. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist as she walked, and the floorboards creaked beneath her boots. At the far end of the hall, a door was slightly open, light spilling out from the crack. She hadn't turned on any lights. Hannah approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at her to leave. She pushed the door open with trembling fingers. The room was empty, except for a mirror standing in the center. It was tall, its ornate frame tarnished with age. The glass was cloudy, but as she stepped closer, she saw her reflection and something else. Behind her stood a woman, her face gaunt and her eyes hollow. She wore a tattered dress, her head cocked at an unnatural angle. Hannah spun around, but the room was empty. She turned back to the mirror, her reflection still there, but now the woman was closer. Her mouth moved silently, forming words Hannah couldn't hear. The temperature dropped further, and the air felt thick, suffocating. "Leave," the woman in the mirror whispered, her voice low and guttural. Hannah stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. She grabbed her camera and bolted down the stairs, the sound of footsteps following her. As she reached the front door, it slammed shut in her face. "Leave." The voice came again, now echoing through the house. She yanked the door open and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she sprinted to her car. She didn't stop until she was miles away, the manor disappearing into the fog. When she developed the photos the next day, her stomach turned. In every image, the woman appeared, standing in the shadows, watching her. The last photo, taken as she fled, showed the front door. Standing just inside was the woman, her hollow eyes fixed on the camera, her hand raised in a silent wave. Hannah deleted the photos, but it didn't help. That night, she woke to the sound of her rocking chair creaking in the corner of her room. And she wasn't alone. It started with the smell. Jacob first noticed it in the basement of his new house, a faint, sickly, sweet odor that seemed to come and go. The house was old, a fixer-upper he had bought for a steal, but the smell lingered no matter how much he cleaned. He tried everything: bleach, air fresheners, even calling a plumber to check for leaks, but nothing worked. The smell grew stronger at night, and it wasn't long before other things started happening. The lights would flicker, even though the wiring was new. Doors that he swore he had closed would be open in the morning. Objects moved from their places, small things like keys or books, but enough to make him uneasy. Then one night, he heard it. It was a soft thump, like someone dropping something heavy on the floor. Jacob had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the sound made him sit bolt upright. It came again, louder this time, followed by what sounded like faint, shuffling footsteps. His heart pounded as he grabbed the flashlight from his bedside table and crept downstairs. The house was silent except for the groan of old wood beneath his feet. The smell was worse now, thick and cloying, making him gag. The basement door was ajar. Jacob stared at it, the darkness beyond seeming to ripple like a living thing. His flashlight beam trembled as he stepped closer. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. The shuffling stopped. Summoning his courage, he descended the stairs, each step creaking loudly in the stillness. The beam of his flashlight illuminated the unfinished walls and exposed pipes, but there was nothing unusual, at least at first. Then he saw the corner. Something was there, crouched low, its back to him. It was pale, almost skeletal, its limbs impossibly long. The flashlight flickered, and Jacob froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure slowly turned its head, its movements jerky, unnatural. Its face was horrifying, sunken eyes, a twisted, gaping mouth, and skin stretched too tightly over its skull. Jacob stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The creature's head tilted, as if studying him, and then it opened its mouth. The scream that came out wasn't human. Jacob bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind him. He shoved a chair under the doorknob and grabbed his phone, his hands trembling as he tried to dial 911. The line was dead. The lights in the house flickered wildly, and the air grew colder, the smell of decay overpowering. From the basement, he heard it again, the shuffling, now faster, more frantic. Then the door rattled. Jacob pressed himself against the far wall, his eyes fixed on the door as it shook violently. The wood splintered, the chair sliding away as the force on the other side grew stronger. And then it stopped. Silence. Jacob's chest heaved as he waited, every muscle in his body tense. Slowly, he stepped toward the door, his hand reaching for the knob. Before he could touch it, the door exploded open, and the creature lunged at him, its bony fingers outstretched. The last thing Jacob saw was its face, inches from his own, before everything went black. When the neighbors noticed the lights in Jacob's house had been on for days without him leaving, they called the police. The officers found the house empty, except for the basement. There, etched into the walls, were deep, jagged claw marks. And the smell, it was worse than anything they'd ever encountered. The winter storm had come out of nowhere. A howling blizzard that turned the world into a white, frozen void. Emma had been driving home late from her shift at the diner, the roads already treacherous, when her car skidded on black ice and veered into a snowbank. She wasn't hurt, but the car was stuck, and no amount of pushing or pleading was going to free it. Worse, her phone had no signal. She was miles from the nearest town, the wind shrieking around her like a living thing. As the cold began to seep through her jacket, Emma spotted it in the distance, a faint, flickering light. A house. With no other option, she trudged toward it, the snow nearly up to her knees. The house was old, its dark silhouette barely visible against the storm. When she reached the porch, she knocked on the door, her frozen knuckles barely making a sound. To her relief, the door creaked open. "Hello?" she called, stepping inside. The warmth hit her like a wave, and she shivered violently as her body began to thaw. The house was dimly lit, the walls lined with faded wallpaper and old, dusty furniture. A fire crackled in the hearth of the living room, and a faint smell of burning wood filled the air. "Hello?" she called again, louder this time. No answer. She moved toward the fire, her hands outstretched to soak in the heat. As her fingers began to thaw, she noticed something strange. The house was too quiet. No creaking floorboards, no ticking clock, no sounds of life. And then she saw it. On the mantel above the fire was a row of photographs in antique frames. Each one showed a different person, men, women, even children. But the faces were wrong. They were pale, expressionless, their eyes dark and hollow, as if the life had been drained out of them. A chill ran down Emma's spine, and she turned away, suddenly feeling like she was being watched. The wind outside howled louder, and the front door slammed shut on its own. Emma jumped, her pulse quickening as she rushed back to the door, twisting the knob. It wouldn't budge. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she backed away. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. From somewhere deeper in the house, she heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic creaking, like someone rocking in a chair. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice trembling. The creaking stopped. The silence pressed in around her, heavy and suffocating. Emma fumbled for her phone, hoping to use the flashlight, but the screen remained stubbornly dark. The creaking started again, louder this time, and accompanied by another sound, a soft, raspy whisper. "Leave." Emma spun around, her eyes wide. The photographs on the mantel were different now. The people's faces were turned, their hollow eyes staring directly at her. "Leave." The whisper came again, this time from behind her. She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. A figure stood in the doorway, barely visible in the flickering firelight. It was tall and gaunt, its skin as pale as the snow outside, its eyes empty pits of darkness. Emma stumbled backward, her foot catching on the edge of the rug. The figure moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "Leave, while you still can," it whispered, its voice like dry leaves scraping across stone. Emma didn't need to be told twice. She bolted for the back door, her feet slipping on the old wooden floor. She didn't stop to think, didn't look back, just ran into the storm. The snow swallowed her whole, blinding and unrelenting, but she kept running until she found the road again. Hours later, a passing snowplow found her shivering and delirious on the side of the road. When the driver asked her what happened, she could only mutter one word: "The house." The driver frowned. "There's no house out here," he said. Emma insisted, begging him to go back and look. Reluctantly, he agreed. But when they returned to where she had described, there was nothing but an empty stretch of snow-covered woods. No house, no footprints, nothing but the wind howling through the trees. The lighthouse on Black Rock Island had stood for over a century, its beacon guiding ships away from the jagged rocks below. It was a lonely place, surrounded by endless waves and eerie silence, accessible only by a small ferry that rarely ran. For decades, it had been unmanned, the light automated, but when a string of mysterious shipwrecks occurred despite clear weather, the Coast Guard decided to station someone there to investigate. That someone was Henry, a veteran lighthouse keeper who didn't scare easily. He'd spent most of his life in solitude, tending to remote outposts, and he saw the assignment as just another job. The ferry dropped him off with a month's supply of food, a shortwave radio, and strict instructions. Keep the light running, report anything unusual, and don't go exploring the island after dark. Henry laughed off the warning. Superstition was common in places like this. The first week passed uneventfully. The lighthouse was old but sturdy, its light functioning perfectly. At night, Henry would sit in the watchroom, listening to the waves crash against the rocks below. But on the 8th night, the knocking started. It was faint at first, a soft tapping against the heavy metal door at the base of the lighthouse. Henry assumed it was the wind, or maybe debris blown by the sea. But when he went to check, the door was locked tight, and there was nothing outside but darkness. The knocking came again the next night, louder this time. Henry was in the middle of his dinner when it started, the rhythmic sound echoing through the spiral staircase. Annoyed, he grabbed his flashlight and opened the door, expecting to find some animal. The beam of light swept across the rocky shoreline. Nothing. Probably just the wind, he muttered, shutting the door. But deep down, he didn't believe it. By the 3rd night, the knocking had escalated to pounding, the kind that rattled the hinges of the door. Henry sat in the watchroom, gripping his radio, his knuckles white. The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by a new sound, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from the rocks below. It rose and fell, like the cry of a woman in agony. Henry tried to radio the mainland, but the static was deafening. As the wailing continued, he climbed to the lantern room, hoping to see what was making the noise. The beam of the lighthouse swept across the sea, illuminating nothing but waves. And then he saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, standing on the rocks below. Their shapes were indistinct, shrouded in mist, but their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared up at the lighthouse. The wailing grew louder, and Henry stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. When he looked again, the figures were gone, the rocks below empty. For the next several nights, the noises continued, knocking, pounding, wailing, and always the feeling of being watched. On the 12th night, Henry couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a lantern and a crowbar, he decided to confront whatever was haunting the lighthouse. He descended the spiral staircase, each step creaking beneath his boots. The air grew colder as he neared the base, and the smell of salt and decay filled his nostrils. When he opened the door, the sight stopped him cold. The figures were there, standing in a semicircle around the lighthouse. This time they were closer, their faces pale and waterlogged, their eyes empty sockets. One stepped forward, its skeletal hand reaching out. "Why didn't you save us?" it whispered, its voice gurgling like it was speaking through water. Henry stumbled back, the lantern slipping from his grasp and shattering on the rocks. The figures surged forward, their cries rising into a deafening cacophony. The next morning, the ferry captain arrived to check on Henry. The lighthouse door was open, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, the place was empty, save for a puddle of seawater on the floor. Henry was never found, and the light at Black Rock Island went dark forever. To this day, sailors swear they can hear the wailing as they pass by, and on stormy nights, some claim to see a figure in the lantern room, staring out to sea with empty eyes.